The next step a would-be dictator always takes is to restrict the press. Of course, this is really scary, to me, but it should scare all of us.
There can be no excuse for anyone entrusted with vital intelligence to leak it, and no excuse for any newspaper to print it.
Bill Keller, the executive editor of the New York Times, chose to publish a story that revealed that the White House, under the guise of fighting terror, was secretly and illegally monitoring financial transactions through a Belgian telecom company called SWIFT.
Some in the press, in particular the New York Times, have made the job of defending against further terrorist attacks more difficult by insisting on publishing detailed information about vital national security programs.
There was this drumbeat of sound bites from the White House: treason, treason, treason.
Right-wing pundits and elected officials immediately called for the prosecution of the New York Times and its confidential sources under the Espionage Act.
And I'm calling on the Attorney General to begin a criminal investigation and prosecution of the New York Times, its reporters, the editors that worked on this, and the publisher.
Other pundits used White House sound bites that called for Bill Keller's prosecution on the basis of treason.
Anybody who leaks or publishes classified data in a time of war in a highly successful program such as the SWIFT base, they should be tried for treason. If they were found guilty of treason, I would have no problem with them being executed.
There was this soundbite: prosecute such reporters under the Espionage Act. Prosecute reporters who release classified information under the Espionage Act. Well, anyone who works in journalism knows that up and down New York and Washington, good reporters are transmitting classified information all the time because that's how they do their jobs. This is really scary when you've read the history of closing societies, because what immediately comes to mind is that in 1936 and 37, Nikolai Bukharin, the editor of Izvestia, the equivalent of the New York Times in Russia, was charged with treason by Stalin. He was tried in a kangaroo court in the Third Moscow Show Trial and was in fact executed.
The Espionage Act of 1917 was passed in the run-up to the First World War. The Espionage Act basically made it a crime to criticize the war. It equated dissent with espionage.
And what it did was it allowed agents of the state to round up ordinary citizens, librarians, activists, labor leaders, journalists, without warrants. Often these people were beaten, they were imprisoned.
Eugene Debs, a presidential candidate at the time, was sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Espionage Act. His crime? He had given a speech about the First Amendment.
So this sweep of the Espionage Act silenced dissent in the United States for a decade. So when you start to hear this drumbeat, treason, treason, espionage, espionage, try them under the Espionage Act, you know that you have moved into a very dangerous place in a closing society. Bilal Hussein was an AP photographer. He was part of a team of photojournalists who were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for their documentation of the war in Fallujah. He was seized by the US military and held for over a year. The AP couldn't find out where he was, what happened to him, what the charges were against him. The charge was that he hung around insurgents. Let me tell you, as a journalist, you don't get the story without hanging around your subjects, right? That was a crime. He was practicing journalism. But in that time, if you're the head of the Associated Press and your guy's in custody, God knows what's happening to him, how tough are you going to be on the White House, right? You think it doesn't send a chill?
Hussein has maintained his innocence, insisting he was only doing the work of a news photographer in a war zone.
You could say, well, that's Iraq. But what if reporters here in the United States get threatened with jail for the crime of practicing journalism?
Public safety is traffic hazard.
Get back! Everybody get back! Everybody step back!
Another really scary example for those of us who are journalists here at home is Josh Wolf, no relation. He's an American freelance journalist who was jailed by a federal district court for refusing to turn over a collection of videotapes he had made during a political protest.
About 2 days after I filmed that protest, the FBI showed up at my house and asked a bunch of questions and wanted to obtain a copy of the full tape.
Even after the FBI's subpoenas, Josh Wolf acted like a journalist and refused to turn over his sources. For this, he was sentenced to prison.
I figured it would be the journalist spent the night in jail and they decided to drop the subpoena afterwards.
This wasn't the case.
You're taken by U.S. Marshals from a courtroom, forced to strip down to absolutely nothing, handcuffs in the front, a chain around my waist tied to my feet. I remember seeing this very large guy, giant guy, shaved head, tattoos, looked completely scary as all can be. He's like, "So what are you in here for?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm a journalist that refused to provide tape and testify before a grand jury about protesters." And he's like, "So you're here for not snitching? That's amazingly cool, man." He's like, "Be sure to tell people about that. You'll get respect. You won't have anything to worry about." And I'm like, all right, note to self, I'm here for not snitching.
Josh served 226 days in an 8 by 10 foot cell. His sentence was longer than that for any journalist in U.S. history.
The real risk, the real frightening fact was that the federal government was trying to obtain the identities of people who don't support what this government is doing and using a journalist as an agent, a de facto agent, to do it.
When I was speaking to intelligence officials about WMD in Iraq, they were willing to speak precisely because they knew that I would protect that confidentiality. And when you lose that ability to guarantee somebody's, to protect your sources, then you lose that information. Ultimately, it's the public as a whole that loses.
Move! 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 Gentlemen being arrested, and there are a lot of us, but... What the fuck? Look at this shit!